Okay. It's recording now.
Great.
So, welcome, Pete. Tell us a little bit about who you are, a little bit of what you do, and why
Yeah,
Christian fasting is important.
absolutely. So I guess you could say I'm a Christian emergency medicine physician.
Mm.
I've been working in ERs for the last 8 years or more. And, my shifts can be day, night, holiday, weekend, etc. And so sickness and suffering happens all the time. We have to be ready. And one of the interests and passions I have in addition to medicine is sort of preventative medicine, which, comes down to lifestyle and diet. And I'm also very passionate about my Greek Orthodox Christian heritage, and I think it's important that sometimes we merge these two worlds of the religious and the scientific, of the secular and the religious. And one of those great intersections, I think, can be fasting, this art of fasting. And there's a lot of universal practices that are out there about this tradition. But I will say there's a particular way to do it when you're a Christian. And I think what's so interesting about that approach is that when you do Christian fasting right, not only are you certainly molding your spirit in the right direction, but you're also getting true healing of both soul and body. And as a doctor that really understands this, what the stakes are all about, I wrote a book to try to help people get a little closer to God and a little bit healthier in the process in doing so.
Wow, that's incredible, Pete. Would you look up a little bit more just so that
Yeah.
our eyes can be, because for the people that are going to be watching, it's going to feel weird. But and I know for you it might feel weird, looking up because that's our tendency to look down at the at the screen. But
Yeah.
it's just going to be helpful in the for people watching and more engaging. That's incredible. I mean, that's a background I've it's really new to me. So talk before we go into maybe like the spiritual sides and more in depth of fasting. I'm fascinated by like what does it mean to be Greek Orthodox? How is that different in Christianity? How have you lived it? Like what? Like, I have no idea. So how would you
Yeah.
say is different Christianity?
The way that I would introduce Greek Orthodox Christianity is that it's one of those historic, ancient churches that has been there from the beginning. And I don't just say that as a buzz phrase, but it really is the language that the Bible was written in. Our priests look like the
Mm.
people at the First Nicene Creed that put together the Bible. We are a Christian group that has a hierarchy, but I call it a soft hierarchy. So we don't have a pope, but we have lots of patriarchs, and
Mm.
they're sort of leaders of regions across the world. And in fact, I think there's about 300 million of us across the world with a
Wow.
handful of patriarchs, but there really is no papacy as what's present in the Roman Catholic world. However, we do hold a lot of traditions with them because for the first 1,000 years of Christianity, we were just the same church. In 1054, there was a schism, and we ended up creating an Eastern form of Christianity called Orthodoxy, and a Western form of it called Catholicism. So, the church now, as it stands, being Greek Orthodox, is one of many different Orthodox churches that just have different ethnic names. So you can be Greek Orthodox, and that means you speak Greek in the church. You can be Romanian Orthodox, that means you speak Romanian. But theologically, it's all the same. And one of the really unique practices of being Orthodox, at least for my mother-in-law's perspective, because my mother-in-law is from Poland, she's as Catholic as it gets. But what she doesn't quite understand is this idea of fasting. Why would you ever fast? Do you hate yourself? Is there something wrong with you? And the reality is that maybe there's some truth to all things, but the point is that in fact Christianity was heavy on the fasting for a very, very long time. And I would say now that there are tens of thousands of different Christian groups and different denominations, if you kind of go back to the early church, fasting was a universal for that phase of the church. And Roman Catholics, I would say, have largely forgot fasting, and the Orthodox Church still utilizes it. Although you can imagine people are still resistant to it because to some extent it's difficult. But one of the reasons I think it is more difficult than it has to be is because over the past 2,000 years of optimizing that fasting practice, sometimes we can kind of forget what parts and pieces are supposed to be done at the same time so that it is easier. And that's what the Athos diet is. So the book that I wrote is called the Athos Diet. It is a book based on fasting principles in Christian monasteries throughout the world, but specifically in a place called Athos, Mount Athos, which is a peninsula in Greece. And these people have been outliving modern civilization for 1,200 years. They're outliving us now. They outlived this 1,000 years ago, and they will continue to. And what I did is not only look at what they eat and how much they eat, but when they eat. And between these three prongs, we've created sort of parameters to help Christians fast so that they get both healing of both soul and body in their efforts.
Wow, that's fascinating. That's incredible history. And okay, so let's dig in a little bit more into the fast. But I want to tell you real quick my example, and then maybe you can either give me tips for the next fasting I do. But my example is I had no connection to fasting whatsoever. I mean, other than maybe growing up and, hey, we're going to fast for a day, the entire church, maybe 3 days, and, do it with spiritual purposes. But my wife, she went fully into fasting for like 3 years ago, and she's done multiple 21-day fasts. So we recently finished one of those 21 days. I joined her for the first time.
Oh, wow.
And it's been super surprising. Not only the focus that I was able to attain, like some doctors describe it as the brain fog goes away. That's real. That's true. And it's just like, okay, and then you're listening from the Lord, and everything becomes more clear. Maybe next steps you need to take in your life. So I can see the spiritual benefits and even the physical benefits to it. And coming into it, I thought, how am I going to do this? 21 days sounds like a lot. And then as I dug a little bit more, right, and maybe you can let us know how maybe some principles as we approach fasting from a Christian perspective, because I know some people, and especially in the Orthodox tradition, maybe they fast for 40 days, for even 50 days. And when I learned about the tradition of the church doing this, is the church used to do it for centuries and centuries, where they would fast even, leading up to Easter. They would fast throughout the year, at least twice a week. I'm like, I can't imagine all the things we're losing as Christians. Sure. If we're not doing this, right? If I experienced it in 21 days, the first time in my life, and I've been experiencing breakthroughs at all levels in my life, I'm like, wow, this is significant. We got to look more into that. So this is like a God thing that we're speaking today. So we're just speaking to that, like what are maybe some good approaches as we go into fasting? And we have no idea. We think like, how am I going to do this? 21 days, 40 days. How do I even start?
Well, let's talk about some definitions, because, fasting is a term that has a lot of different meanings. I mean, certainly fasting can be purely something like, hey, I'm not going to eat certain types of foods, where you get rid of whole food categories. I'm not going to eat, processed foods for a month. Okay, that could be fasting. Another form of fasting could be you only eat during a certain period of the day. That's more of an intermittent fasting approach, but you don't really care how much you eat or what you eat. And then, of course, there's other types of fasting where not only are you interested in what types of foods you're eating, but when you're eating and how much you're eating, and combinations of all these three. Historically, if you look at sort of Judeo-Christian history, there was a Daniel's fast, a prophet Daniel's fast, where he ate much of nothing except, I think it was like raw vegetables and water for weeks. There are other examples where Moses, didn't eat anything. Christ himself fasted from food and water, actually, for 40 days, the story goes. And of course, David himself, when he came across the prophet David, many different issues or difficulties in his life, he would fast no food, no drink for days. And everyone seemed to sort of associate that practice of fasting with some spiritual insight. But it wasn't until 2024 or 2025 that through sort of a scientific lens, we could kind of see why the practice of fasting would translate into introspection and to increased energy and to sort of maybe even a superpower per se. But, maybe just to give a few quick examples in the modern times, what people do for fasting, like Roman Catholics before Lent, or for Lent rather, before Easter, oftentimes will give up something. Hey, doc, I'm going to give up chocolate for the month. I'm going to give up soda for the month, something like that. There was an old tradition where people would only eat fish on Fridays. The Greek Orthodox Church has been really into fasting for a long time. And so the standard protocol for fasting for a Greek Orthodox Christian is that you are not eating anything that contains meat or dairy inside of it. Wednesdays and Fridays, just all year long, Wednesdays and Fridays, 40 days leading up to Christmas, 48 days leading up to Easter, several weeks over the summer, in June, and then many more weeks in August. Basically, it turns out that Greek Orthodox Christians are fasting almost like in this pescatarian/vegan style more than half the year. It can be up to 2/3 of the year, depending on that year. And so, we start in our faith at the age of 7 doing this. And so you might say to yourself, oh my gosh, that sounds really extreme. What's going on? Well, there's a lot of reasons why we start early, and there's a lot of reasons why fasting is so paramount to being an Orthodox Christian. And the reason is, and I can tell this from a scientific standpoint, is that when you really look at what is to be human, what is our core, you might close your eyes and touch your head. But when you really look at what the largest nervous system is of the body, it's actually not our brain. And there's ways to describe it to prove that point. But like, your brain is only so big. Your intestine is huge, just by physical space. So when people say, hey, go with your gut, I have butterfly. I just met this girl. My stomach hurts. I have this thing going on. My belly hurts. That's your nervous system talking to you. In fact, it's called the enteric nervous system.
Wow.
And the enteric nervous system is physically larger than your brain. It has more neurons than your spinal cord. It is more complex. And at the same time, it manages these two branches of the nervous system called the sympathetic and parasympathetic. I only bring this all up to say that to not manipulate, to not be aware of, to not press the buttons of our intestinal system, of our enteric nervous system, is to completely lose the mark as to how to change ourselves fundamentally. And, culturally, there's nothing more important to a culture than its food. It's interesting to me that in Christianity, communion is such a huge sacrament of the faith or mystery of the faith. It is a food. And when you have someone over to your house, you break food with them. Like, it's not like you just play music or you do something like that. It's always surrounding food. And the reason for that, again, is because the enteric nervous system is massive. It's sensitive. 30% of our energy every day is just needed to digest food. So it's a huge machine. And then, of course, there's 100 trillion bacteria that live in our intestine. That's more bacteria than cells in your entire body. So all of this comes back to say that the reason in the Christian faith that fasting is so important is because if you want to truly transform and change yourself, you need to be worried about when you eat, what you eat, and how much you eat. And so this book called the Athos Diet is trying to take best practices, as I mentioned, from these monasteries for people outliving a lot of people and bring that to the Christian masses. And specifically, these monks at Mount Athos, they have this practice every day of always being prepared for death, because we as Christians know that this life is transient, that death is coming. You never know when it will come. And as an ER doc, I can tell you there's a lot of unexpected things that happen every day. But because of these monks taking that seriously, these monks not only are preparing, let's say, spiritually, but they are also getting ready to go to liturgy or to mass every day, and they don't eat prior to taking communion. So they won't eat until the late morning, early afternoon, and then they'll only eat a few hours a day. So not only do we care about what they eat and how much they eat, but when they eat. And another tradition apart from this one of fasting until communion every day, which they strive for, is they fast with Christ until he died at the 9th hour. That's 3 p.m. And so a lot of these monks over the centuries have been intermittent fasting without realizing it. It was just part of their culture, their tradition, their prayer life. And the reason that's important is because if you intermittent fast every day of your life, that means you're only eating calories for no more than about 8 hours a day, but you can always go less than that, but no more than 8 hours a day. Every mammal that does that lives 30 to 40% longer.
Wow.
So this is really powerful because as a result of this practice, which of course starts out as a Christian principle, it's an axiom. Because of this spiritual thing, because of this principle I'm going to subject my body to something else. And as a result, God takes care of us. And it's like,
Mhm.
hey, you're going to prepare your soul for death. You're going to prepare for communion every day. You're going to, pursue confession and do the right thing and prepare your soul and forgive your brother and all these things. All this comes with the territory. Well, now suddenly we're getting ready for communion every day, and every day you're intermittent fasting. And as I said, when any mammal does this, they live 30 to 40% longer. And so, that's just topic sentence. And what I do in this book is I show how intermittent fasting, for example, there's two other prongs to the Athos diet too. But for the first prong, for the first pillar, this intermittent fasting portion, I show how scientifically, medically, that actually works out as a longevity exercise.
Mm. Wow.
So
Yes. This is fascinating. I'm taking some notes as you're speaking because uh, I think one of the strongest calls for the Christian, and we can see this in the fruits of the Spirit that God invites us into. One of them is self-control, right? So again, even just from my own experience in the last few days, as I went through my own journey of fasting, I've experienced. Um, there's a lie out there in our society, in our culture. It's not spoken of, but the lie is I can't do this. It's almost like you're a victim of your own desires,
hmm,
right? And I think fasting to me it has been an introduction to self-control, which is one of the fruits of the spirit. And I think what a better way to introduce self-control than with something that our bodies we think, oh, my body needs food, and it's true. But I love that as you're talking about this Athos diet. Yes, it does need food, but can you control when and what and how?
and exactly. And because we're doing that with food, and because we're interacting with the enteric nervous system, and we're changing ourselves fundamentally in doing that, when you talk about delayed gratification,
Hmm.
discipline, consistency, being in, having dominion over your body, that will change you spiritually as well. Like, what horse are you going to bet on to say no to when they're feeling, temptations to abuse drugs or abuse women, or to get angry? Is it going to be the person that, has never fasted, or the person that has fasted and every hour of the day for many decades has had that feeling of, I want to reach for this thing, for this impulse, for this something that makes me almost irrational. Like, I just have to eat this food. But the reality is that when people fast and they're like, oh my gosh, doc, I don't know if I can get to, this next hour. The reality is that most people have enough fat on their body to go about 3 months without food.
Wow.
And in fact, the guy that lasted the longest without any food whatsoever lived over a year. So it's so ridiculous. It's so ridiculous that we are living in such the modern age and we don't know our own strength, our own superpowers. But I'm
Mm.
telling you that it is a superpower. And one of the reasons I recommend fasting for children, and again, fasting is a generic word, and we have to be careful because I would not
Mhm.
recommend a 7-year-old going 40 days without food. Okay, that's not what
Mhm.
I'm recommending. I'm recommending they do the Athos diet, but what I recommend in the book is that people eat no more than 8 hours a day, but they can get down to 4 hours. That's preferred, but no more than eight. That they're trying to eat as much protein as they can get, but it's from a plant-based source. And then finally, in regards to exercise, they're just walking no less than 30 minutes a day. When you do
Mhm.
these three things, you will heal both soul and body. And one of the things that the Orthodox Church, or the Christian, this Christian church, has been recommending is that people start this practice at the age of 7. And you might
Wow.
say to yourself, "Oh my gosh, that sounds really extreme. Shouldn't they be, developing, and we shouldn't be worried so much about all these things?" Well, I can answer that with two quick responses. One is that we have a healthcare crisis in America, where because we
Mm.
aren't really caring about our children's health, children now are getting diabetes, high cholesterol. They're supposed to get screened for these things at 10, and some of them are even going on drugs like Ozempic to try to lose weight. It's pretty extreme. So rather than putting kids on prescription drugs to help them lose weight, I say, why don't we just reintroduce Christian fasting? Because we are a Christian country,
Wow.
and these children could benefit from that. I think this is really important to highlight. There's this study called the ACE study. And the ACE study took young children, they watched them over many decades. There's like 10 to 20,000 of them, watched them over many decades, and they found out that some percentage of these children lived about 20 years younger, or sorry, 20 years. Let me put this: they died 20 years younger than the rest of everyone else. And they started to look at this group and try to figure out why that is. Well, it turns out that when children are exposed to adverse childhood events, that's what ACE stands for, adverse childhood events. That includes people fighting each other, drug abuse, pornography, being neglected, being abused, assaulted. Their body and their life manifests from this trauma in true disease later on in life. They are more prone to alcoholism, to drug abuse, to divorce, for unemployment, for cardiovascular disease. Literally, the body keeps the score. So I view these things as a child, and suddenly I manifest these things as trauma and as poor outcomes and coping mechanisms in the rest of my life that literally translates ultimately to an early death. And I bring this up to say that if we know from the ACE study that bad things can make a child manifest bad things the rest of their life and truly shorten their lives, then what is the power of doing something good at a young age do for them? And one of those good things I think that we should incorporate into their lives is fasting. Because if I can teach a 7-year-old delayed gratification, self-empowerment, how to say no, how to be disciplined, how to understand sort of the longer time horizon, quality over quantity, what wonderful things will they be capable of doing? Not like later on in life, just say, but even then and throughout their lives. And it's very true. It's very true. And I think that's why we all inherently feel this need to protect children, because we know that those formative years really do manifest as good or bad outcomes later on in life. And so, in my opinion, being a Christian nation and trying to incorporate Christian fasting is already at a young age, if we just chose to use this tool, could save us from a lifetime of addiction, from relationship problems, from issues with gaining too much weight because we're gluttonous, or seeking after women because we have lust, or being lazy because we don't have the discipline to kind of keep the routine going. And so all of this is in the wisdom of the church, is one of these universal reasons, or one of these reasons why this universal practice of fasting should be used as a Christian as early as possible. Well, and in the tradition of the church, it's about 7 years of age.
Wow. That's amazing. Okay, is there any negative way to fast? And I'm trying to find. I know there's kind of like a story in the Bible, and I can't right now. It's not coming to me where I can point you to it. But there's a few verses where I remember it says something along the lines of like, some people committed to not eating until they would, take down the enemy, right? In this case, the Israelites.
Wow,
Is there any way in which people can take fasting, but almost with an evil intention, and saying, I'm going to abstain from food, so that I can, just fulfill an evil purpose?
Well, you could say this, why does a man prepare his body to attract a woman? Is it so that he can get married and have children and be a king of his little kingdom? Or is it so he can just screw around with as many people as possible, avoid all responsibility and duty? So you can see, these tools are superpowers, and we have to make sure that we use them in the right effort, for the right trajectory, the right purpose. But I'll respond with two ways about this question you bring up, which I think is a good one. Yeah, there's this tradition in the old days of, hey, I'm not going to eat or drink until I've completed this vow. And I think there was even a group of Jewish people who were trying to kill St. Paul at one point for that same point, or that same approach. Hey, we're not eating or drinking until we kill St. Paul. Of course, he escaped. But I'll say this. One is, we don't want to become anorexics. That's a real disease. There are a lot of women out there that struggle with that. Exceedingly rare in men, but it's somewhat more common in women. But it's interesting to me. They are intermittent fasting. I mean, one of the reasons I think we should not necessarily just completely tell them, hey, you're doing something wrong, is like, well, they do have discipline. They do know what delayed gratification is. I don't want to rob them of that, but we do need to rein in their sins of the left and sins of the right. We need to rein in their goals so that it actually becomes a healthy thing instead of something that breaks them down. And so the Athos diet, as I said, every day you are breaking your fast every day. You're only eating, between 4 and 8 hours a day. As a doctor, if I was taking care of an anorexic patient, I would tell them they can keep fasting, but you got to eat once a day, and that's got to be filled with nutritious foods. And so in that way, I'm not telling this person with this gift per se to shut off a whole portion of who they are. In fact, I think the only reason that they are able to sustain themselves for such a long time as being anorexic is because there's some benefit to it, both spiritual and physical. But we as mentors and as docs and as people who have been through this need to help them understand the goal. And it's interesting to me too. I've never met an anorexic person who's doing it for God. I mean, I always thought that was interesting, right? They're never saying, "Hey, I haven't eaten for X amount of days because I'm trying to connect with my Savior." It's about them, which is interesting. That's an interesting that's not a coincidence. So anyway, but as I say, one way or another with the Athos diet, every day you are eating all the necessary food you must. Now, you might be in caloric deficit. It might be a particular type of food, in this case, plant-based protein, but you are eating every day. And so for people who are anorexics, I would say, hey, I don't want to take your superpower away, but I need to re-guide you. I need to redirect you in a slightly way. And then for the person who is fasting and now has all these powers, we got to make sure we're doing it so that you can lift up the weak, so that you can support your community, so that you can get spiritual insight. And it's not just for like a six-pack on the beach. And of course, if the six-pack comes, then by all means, no problem. But that's not the reason we're doing it. And as a physician, as a doctor who sees suffering every day in the ER, I just worked 5 night shifts in a row, and I'm coming off my night shifts here. But the reason I bring this up is I understand that the stakes are so much higher than just vanity at the beach on the summer. We're talking about the difference between life and death, the difference between making it to Christmas and to Easter this year to be with your family. I've buried plenty of people on Christmas Day. People get heart attacks all the time. Isn't it interesting that in the wisdom of the church, you're supposed to fast for 40 days for the one and 48 days for the other holiday? There have been studies that show that if you have coronary artery disease and various other ailments, you can reverse a lot of those risk factors in as little as 30 to 40 days. So again, it's like you think the church is just trying to make you do something for the sake of, I don't know, some like happy, go fun, kumbaya moment. It's not. It's literally them trying to say, do you want to be there with your family for Christmas this year? Do you want to avoid that heart attack, that stroke, that spike in sugar that might make you go into DKA? I mean, all of these things. And so in the wisdom of the church, it's like, hey, here's the salve, and it's called fasting.
Wow. That's so intense. So I have and it's kind of funny because on our website, christianpodcast.com, we have a club that we started, and we're calling it Theophilians Club, those who love God. And, I mean, this comes from the Greeks. I'm like, wow, that's so interesting that today we're talking about this topic. And I want to invite people to go check that out, because the next question, I'm going to put it on our website, on our exclusive page for Theophilians, those who love God, right? That's what it means. And it's just a fun way, for people who love God to be a part of our website and journey and community and get exclusive content. But, one of the questions I want to ask is, as it relates to what you're saying, the superpower. I mean, I think that's a great way to put it, because we're in America where, the stories about superheroes is the ones that we go watch on the cinema, right? The Hollywood hits and stuff. We always want to be the superhero. And it's so interesting that in America, we want to attain these high levels of power, right? I mean, that's really what it is, right? What would it mean for me to have this superpower, right? And we can think about many ways in, flying over the air, rays coming out of your eyes or whatever it might be. But in this case, you're saying the church has a superpower. And I would love to ask you, what's the relationship with, when Jesus says some type of, he uses the word demons, and maybe you can elaborate on what that means, evil spirits, right? But when he says some sort of spirits don't come out without prayer and fasting. I mean,
Yeah.
that takes a superpower.
Yeah, no, well said, amen. I mean, it's funny you bring up this passage because this has everything to do with fasting. I'll give you a reason for that. 100 years ago, Dr. Conklin read that same verse about basically God casting out the demon from a man who was an epileptic.
Mhm.
And remember, so the apostles go over to heal him. They can't do it. He still has his seizures, and then finally Christ comes over, heals the epileptic. And what happens next? They ask him why they couldn't do it, and he says, "Hey, some of these things just can't be solved without prayer and fasting. Prayer and fasting."
Mhm.
So Dr. Conklin takes this seriously. He takes 20 plus epileptic children that no one can heal. And he says, "You know what, guys? You're not going to do anything except eat water and vitamins for the next so many weeks." And guess what happens? The seizures went away. The
Wow.
seizures went away. And in fact, this is because they switched from a source of burning sugar for fuel to ketones. And
Mm.
that's one of the first physiological changes that occurs when you fast. Is that when you fast by eating no calories, by the way, not just by eating no soda, but by eating no calories, period, you eventually from eating sugar, let's say, as a fuel for your body to burning fat. And fat releases ketones when it's broken down, and that goes to the brain and lowers, or I should say, protects from seizures. It
Mm.
also, interestingly, lowers anxiety because
Wow.
it acts on the same receptors of the brain that alcohol and benzodiazepines act on, except with this technique, you don't like become an alcoholic, lose your job, and have your kids hate you. This is
Mhm.
this is a natural daily practice that optimizes your brain with like zero side effects. And so again, inherent in this command from God of have faith,
Mm.
pray and fast, there is a scientific mechanistic outcome that God created the world, right? These are his rules. This is his
Mhm.
system. So yeah, you fast and this is what happens. It's not just like magic. Like we're not just some ghosts floating around cloaked in flesh. This is part and parcel of what it means to be human, having both soul and body. It's in the resurrection, it's our soul and our body that are resurrected. It's not just our souls. and
Mm.
and so I'm just quoting scripture now, and the reason I bring
Mhm.
this up is to say that we have to stop looking at our bodies as somehow the enemy. I mean,
Mm.
it is a tool to be mastered, but it's not necessarily something we should ignore. I don't think that spiritual people are supposed to be morbidly obese. I don't
Mm.
think spiritual people should have any of the vices that are often carnal, like lust, obsessive, etc., angry, quick to anger. All of these things, ultimately are almost outcomes of our human fleshly nature. But anyway, so this doctor took this commandment very seriously, this passage, and in fact today there is a ketogenic diet that's recommended for epileptics, in particular
Mm.
types of epileptics, that gets rid of their seizures. And it's just wild. It's just wild.
Mhm.
And I'll tell you, 80 to 90% of all disease that we know about is entirely preventable.
Wow.
So when we ask ourselves the ethical questions, oh God, why have you forsaken us? Why is there so much suffering in the world? Well, buddy, you can take care of the first 80 to 90%. And once you do that, then you can start criticizing God. I'm just saying is
Wow.
let's have some humility and
Mm.
understand that 80 to 90% of all the sorrow and the suffering is
Wow.
entirely self-inflicted. And I really believe that fasting, the way that it has been prescribed through the church and has lived for the last 2,000 years, and is especially found at Mount Athos through this combination of intermittent fasting, plant-based protein, and walking, 80 to 90% of disease can be thwarted. And I'm not telling people they have to do this every day. The Athos diet itself mimics Great Lent, and then it recommends people incorporate this into their lives like the church does, Wednesdays and
Mhm.
Fridays, the occasional fast through the summer, leading up to Christmas. Bring that into your life. And what I think is so awesome about these conversations these days about aligning every fractal of your life towards the highest good, as a father, as a community member, as citizens of a nation, all these different things, aim them towards God. Well, how do you get the most base level of yourself aimed towards God? That's through fasting. That's through fasting. It's how do we align even every cell in our body towards the highest good, and that's through fasting. And it's a
Mhm.
feedback mechanism too. We need to be able to connect the highest and the lowest. That's how every healthy organism acts as well. Not only do they have alignment, but they have feedback. And so
Mhm.
to not fast is to miss out hugely on what it means to be human and spiritual. And
Mhm.
and and Beto, I just wanted to say that mechanistically, and I'm just going to throw this out there because we don't have time to explore it all. But when you do fasting in the way that I'm describing it through the Athos diet, you upregulate things called sirtuins in your cells that literally heal your telomeres and your DNA and your mitochondria. You turn on processes like autophagy, where you're getting rid of old cells and old organelles within those cells that are no
Mhm.
longer working, and you're recycling them. You're increasing growth hormone, which is a longevity hormone, 200%, 300%. You're doing this every day. In addition to that, you're increasing your metabolism, so you truly are losing weight as a result of this practice of eating food in this way with no other changes. You're reducing inflammation, you're reducing cholesterol, you're reducing hypertension. All of these things have been found to result of this fasting practice. You are increasing sympathetic intervention. So I was mentioning to you about how one of the largest pieces of the nervous system are in the gut. When you fast, you upregulate this thing called the sympathetic nervous system. It's like having natural catecholamines, endorphins circulating to give you more energy. So this
Mhm.
idea that we're supposed to snack all day is actually entirely opposite of what we're supposed to do. If we were to
Mhm.
actually wait in the morning, wake up in a fasted state and keep that going, you will actually have more energy. Drink all the black coffee you want. You can have caffeine, but don't reach for a calorie. All of these
Mhm.
things change. And there's also this thing called mitophagy, which is a process where mitochondria get cleaned up in the process of fasting. Um, there's just myriads and myriads of health benefits from fasting that
Mhm.
no medicine in the world can rival. I
Mhm.
mean, if I could, give you an example. When people take aspirin when they're about to have a heart attack, how many people do you think you need to give that aspirin to get one good benefit? We call that the number needed to treat. Any idea? Any gut feeling? It's like, this guy's having a heart attack, doc. Oh my God, let's at least get him the aspirin. What what is what, you have to give like 40 people aspirin to have just one of them benefit from it.
Wow.
So that is, I mean, that's, if by all means, let's do whatever we can. You never know if you're one of those 40 people, but that's
Mm.
standard of care. Well, we have this thing called Christian fasting, which might allow us to get rid of 80 to 90% of all disease and give you superpowers and give you longevity and improve the
Mhm.
quality of your life. And it's the most meek Christian thing in the world. It
Mhm.
so rings to the theme of Christianity.
Mhm.
In meekness you will find strength. The meek shall inherit the earth. And what is the way that we can get rid of 80 to 90% disease and live 40% longer and enjoy quality over quantity? It's through fasting. It's through fasting. It's not by doing some complex thing that costs a lot. It's just by trusting in the faith of the church, living in those ways, prayer and fasting over and over and
Mhm.
over again. Imagine what the world would look like at scale. The United States would look like at scale if people did this seriously on a population basis. We would have empty ERs. The hospitals
Mm.
wouldn't be full. People would be so clear-minded. And I'll tell you
Mhm.
right now, and I'm just getting this all in because I know we don't have that much time. But one of the reasons I think it's also important we recognize the importance of fasting now while there's still time is that when you fast, you get this upregulation of something called BDNF. And BDNF protects you from Alzheimer's, Huntington's disease, Parkinson's disease, dementia. There is a huge pandemic coming, basic epidemic, I could call it, in the United States, of the baby boomers getting older, and a lifetime of bad diet and exercise and lifestyle decisions is finally culminating in all sorts of forms of neurodegenerative disease. And so I bring this up to say that when you fast, you get an upregulation of BDNF, which protects you from all of these diseases. Imagine
Mhm.
society where your grandparents aren't senile and confused and weak
Mm.
and falling and incontinent, and they can really be people who are models in your life. They can give you instruction and be there for you and to reassure you that, hey, this too shall pass. But now we've set our grandparents up for a lifetime of this, well, and the last decade of their life in chronic and terrible diseases. And there's nothing more disorienting than being disoriented.
Mhm.
I don't know if you ever had a sick parent, but if they don't know where they are and who they are and what's going on, they don't really seem like your parent anymore.
Mhm.
It's like they lose themselves. And so, what can we do to avoid that and maybe even treat that? Well, fast. And so again, I just want to make this theme very consistent and very clear. The salve for suffering in this world is through something like fasting, and it's a universal practice. The first commandment in Genesis was to fast from a certain food.
Mm.
It is fundamental. Why did God choose a fasting principle to determine whether or not Adam and Eve would stay in the Garden of Eden? It's because fasting is so core to who we are.
Mm.
And I'm
Wow.
telling you, my theory is if you can get a person to fast and do it right and learn delayed gratification and discipline and sacrifice and the timeliness of things, that you don't need to ever leave the Garden of Eden. Like
Mm.
that's the whole point. And what's
Wow.
what's the best proxy for all manner of sin that comes after it? Well, can you keep the fast? Because if you
Mm.
if you can do these basic things, as I mentioned, nothing will be your enemy. You'll be able to have dominion over the whole world, or specifically yourself anyway. And
Mhm.
and so anyway, this is the Christian mandate to fast, so we can
Mhm.
have both spiritual and physical healing, and we should start as early as possible. And in wisdom of the church, that's been about this year of 7. But what an interesting thing that in a country that's supposed to be Christian, that doesn't have these principles in mind, that 100 million people have diabetes or pre-diabetes, that children have now high cholesterol and hypertension at 10, that the average age of death in America is happening earlier now, even though we're the wealthiest country in the world. We have people that are morbidly obese, that have strokes, that have every manner of disease, and much of these disease, 80-90% of these diseases are entirely preventable, and there Jesus is there for us to just take that weight off of us, and
Mm.
a tool to do that is through fasting.
Wow. Dr. Pete, that is so profound. That what a great invitation. And I want to say from my vantage point, I think this is the perfect case because I never thought I was going to do a fast.
Mm.
Right? And I did it, and my invitation to people is yes, you can. You can do this. And
Yeah.
I'm actually going to look into the Athos diet because I think it's going to be essential. This was the first time I ever did it. And as I came out of it, I had this like almost like overwhelming impression on me that this is not going to be the last one you do, you know? And
Victor, I'll
yes.
tell you, there's studies that show that people that do a water only fast for 7 days, I mean, like decrease their cancer risk forever. It's the
Wow.
craziest thing. It's the craziest thing, and it's amazing you went 21 days. But what I'll
Mhm.
tell people, and I think this is important, the reason I recommend that people reset every 24 hours. This is like you're starting out where you are. You're trying to incorporate prevention into your life, but you don't have cancer right now. You don't have major disease. The more sick you are, the more extreme you need to be with your fasting.
Mm.
So, so basically, if you're a 20-some-year-old who's just trying to live a healthy life and to avoid 90% of disease, I think the 24-hour rhythm is the healthiest form of that. Every day, you got to do this, some form of the Athos diet. And what I tell people is, for every day of the year, I'm intermittent fasting and I'm exercising. But
Mm.
depending on the cycle of the year, if it's a Wednesday, Friday, if it's leading up to Christmas and Easter, that's when I become a vegan, basically. But
Mhm.
outside of those seasons, I'm still doing the intermittent fasting and exercise, but I'm eating all the meat and dairy I want. I'm getting high protein, I'm
Mhm.
avoiding carbs. But if I was sick, if I knew I had pancreatic cancer, if I knew I had, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, my doc was telling me, hey man, we're looking at this scan here. We're seeing that you have a lot of plaque. I would definitely go and do probably something akin to what you have, which is like a 7-day water fast, a 21 day water fast. I think that's where you need to throw in sort of those bigger fasting practices into getting yourself better. It's proportionate to the state of illness that you're in right now. However, a nice warm up to developing the discipline to get to 7 days and 21 days is probably a daily a daily effort where things reset all the time. But yeah, God bless you, Peter. That's pretty impressive. 7 or 21 days. That's really something.
21. And also I guess just the parallel that I see in scripture of how many people fasted, right? You mentioned Moses, Jesus himself, Peter, like all these people. And it was almost like kind of like what catapulted them into their ministry, into what they were known for. So as I stepped into this, I felt like, okay, even just the website, I feel like we've been getting more hits from around the world. Our YouTube channel's growing, and I'm not gonna, I mean, in a sense, yes, I'm gonna say it's directly directed by the fasting that we did, and I know some people might say that's kind of crazy to think, but something happened in the spiritual.
I am confident
it's reflecting in this. Yeah.
I'm confident that the world will bend and that you will bend and through this practice of fasting. And so whether you get more efficient with your time, whether you're eliminating things that are no longer high yield, why are we spending all this time eating, preparing food, cleaning up after it? What else could I do with that time? With this upregulation, the sympathetic nervous system, where I have all these endorphins moving now, etc. What kind of creative thoughts can I create? What kind of insight can I gather? And what kind of energy do I have now to achieve my goals? And so, no coincidence at all. I think that there's a seen world and an unseen world, and I think at the very least, maybe we as earthly human beings, as doctors, physicians, people with interest, using the scientific method, we can try to describe the backdrop to this spiritual world as much as possible. But I don't disagree at all. I do think there's a spiritual reality there, and I'm so glad to hear that you're getting some return on investment, some inspiration from this undertaking. It's really wonderful to hear.
Thanks, Dr. Pete. So finally, we got to wrap this up, but where can people find your book? You have a website. Where is it available? How can people, maybe even, do you have a program where you can help people through it? Or
Yeah, we have a website called the Athos Diet, and Athos is spelled ATHOS, theathosdiet.com. And on that website, you can see we have our podcast position there. We have our book that you can buy. We have a YouTube channel that I come out with different updates and pieces of counsel there throughout for your fasting periods. It's all there. And we've sold books now on every continent of the world. And, there are Christians everywhere. And I'm telling you, humanity would benefit from fasting. But fasting is not a humanitarian undertaking. It's a spiritual undertaking. It's a Christian undertaking. And we already have version 1 of what happens when we just get secular. Well, you have a very sick, overweight nation called America. And if we really were to get serious about our Christian lives and incorporating Christian fasting, there in that is 30 to 40% longevity benefit, 90% of all disease gone, and you will have dominion over your soul and your body, and there's nothing better than that. So by all means, come over to the website. There's a great community there, and I think you'll find that this is a good use of your time and another augmenter to your spiritual life.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Pete, and Theophilians tuning into this episode. So glad you guys were here. See you guys on the next one.